The day Grandma Evelyn's will was read was the day the cracks in our family turned into a full-blown earthquake. Evelyn Carter wasn't just a wealthy woman, she was loaded. Her estate was worth $1.2 million, divided between her sprawling mansion, stocks, bonds, and a few rare art pieces that were probably worth more than my entire apartment complex. But what really made her wealth legendary in our family wasn't just the money, it was the way she handled it. Grandma Evelyn was sharp, calculating, and always 5 steps ahead. So when the lawyer started reading her will, we all expected something dramatic. But nothing could have prepared us for what we heard. To my 3 sons, Mark, Joe, and Simon, the lawyer began, his voice echoing in the grand dining room. We were all sitting there, Mark with his Rolex flashing under the chandelier, Joe fiddling with his phone like he was too busy for this, and Simon, who just looked uncomfortable. Like he'd rather be anywhere else. I leave my fortune of $1.2 million to be divided equally under one condition. The lawyer paused. You could feel the tension in the room. The 3 of you must come to a unanimous decision on how to divide the inheritance. If you cannot agree within 6 months, the entire amount will be donated to charity. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, predictably, Mark exploded, unanimous. Are you kidding me? This isn't a boardroom vote, it's a will. Just split it 3 ways and call it a day. Joe, ever the opportunist, tried to calm him down. Relax, Mark. We'll figure it out. We just have to be smart about it. Simon didn't say much. He rarely did. But I could see the anxiety in his eyes. Simon had always been the odd one out, quieter, more thoughtful, not nearly as cutthroat as his older brothers. And as I watched Mark and Joe exchange a look that could only be described as conspiratorial, I knew one thing for sure: Simon was about to be in serious trouble. Mark and Joe didn't waste any time. That night, I overheard them talking in the study. Look, Mark said, his voice low but intense, Simon's a pushover. We just have to make him think he's getting a fair deal, and he'll agree to whatever we say. Joe chuckled. Exactly. We split it 2 ways and toss Simon some scraps. He won't fight us, he never does. They didn't even try to hide their intentions. But the thing about Simon was, he wasn't as clueless as they thought. The next morning, Simon pulled me aside. Do you think they are planning something? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. I mean, it's Mark and Joe. Of course they are. Simon sighed. Yeah, that's what I thought. Things took a turn a few days later when we started clearing out Grandma Evelyn's mansion. In the attic, hidden behind boxes of old Christmas decorations, Simon found a sealed letter addressed to him. His hands trembled as he opened it. Simon, it began, if you're reading this, it means you found yourself at the mercy of your brothers. I know them well enough to predict how they'll act when I'm gone. But you've always been different, kind, fair, and perhaps too trusting for your own good. That's why I'm leaving you this. Inside the envelope was a key. No explanation, no context, just a small, antique key that looked like it belonged to a treasure chest. Simon was baffled. What do I do with this? He asked me later. I had no idea. But I told him one thing: whatever it is, don't tell Mark and Joe. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, the tension between the brothers grew. Mark and Joe started holding meetings without Simon, claiming they were just getting organized. Simon, meanwhile, became increasingly paranoid. He started locking his bedroom door at night and carrying the mysterious key with him everywhere he went. Then, out of nowhere, Mark announced that he and Joe had drawn up a proposal for dividing the inheritance. It's simple, he said, sliding a stack of papers across the dining table. Simon gets $100,000 and Joe and I split the rest. It's fair, he's never been interested in the business side of things anyway. Simon was furious. Fair? Are you kidding me? That's not even close to fair. Mark shrugged. Take it or leave it. Remember, if we don't agree, the money goes to charity. Do you really want that? It was a brutal ultimatum. And for a moment, I thought Simon might cave. But then he did something unexpected. He stood up, looked Mark in the eye, and said, I'm not signing anything until I talk to my lawyer. Mark and Joe were stunned. Simon had never stood up to them before. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes. That night, Simon finally decided to use the key. He waited until everyone else was asleep, then crept down to the basement. I went with him, mostly because I was too curious to stay behind. The safe was hidden behind an old bookshelf. Simon inserted the key, and with a soft click, the door swung open. Inside was a stack of papers and another letter from Grandma Evelyn. Simon, the letter began, "This safe contains the documents you'll need to prove your worth in the inheritance battle. Use them wisely, and remember, trust is earned, not given." The papers were a mix of legal documents and financial records. At first glance, I couldn't make sense of them. But Simon's face lit up. This could change everything," he whispered. What he didn't know was that Mark and Joe were already one step ahead. And they weren't going to let him win without a fight. This was only the start of a battle that would tear the family apart. Stay tuned for part 2, because things are about to get even messier. If you thought things were tense after the will was read, what happened next cranked the family drama up to an entirely new level. The papers Simon found in the basement safe turned out to be an ace in the hole, but not the kind he could play right away. He needed time to understand them, and time was a luxury Mark and Joe weren't going to give him. The documents in the safe were a mix of Grandma Evelyn's personal notes, business agreements, and legal contracts. The most interesting piece: a signed addendum to the will. It wasn't legally binding, just a handwritten letter she'd sent to her lawyer years ago, outlining her hopes for how the money would be divided. In it, she wrote, "Simon is my only son with a true heart. While Mark and Joe have the ambition to succeed, Simon has the character to make the world better. My intention is for Simon to receive a larger share, though I fear the others will try to stop this." It was explosive, but there was a catch. The addendum wasn't notarized, which meant it held no legal weight. If Simon tried to use it in court, Mark and Joe would dismiss it as a personal note with no significance. Still, it gave Simon something valuable, leverage, but Mark and Joe weren't sitting idle. The brothers doubled down on their plan to cut Simon out. They started spreading rumors within the family, framing Simon as ungrateful and difficult. They told everyone that he was holding up the inheritance because he didn't want to compromise, planting the idea that he was selfish. I'll never forget one specific moment. We were all sitting around the kitchen table when Mark turned to Simon with a smirk. "You know, if you keep dragging this out, the money's just going to charity. Is that what you want? To let Grandma's hard-earned fortune disappear?" Simon clenched his fists. "I'm not dragging anything out. I just want what's fair." Joe leaned in, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "Fair? Come on, Simon. You've never cared about the business side of the family. You've always been the artsy one. Why not let us handle the heavy lifting? We'll even make sure you get a little something on the side." It was insulting, and Simon knew it. But instead of lashing out, he played it cool. "I'll think about it," he said, standing up and walking out of the room. Simon had a plan, and it involved the one person Mark and Joe couldn't manipulate, Evelyn's old financial advisor, Mr. Prescott. Prescott had been with Evelyn for decades, managing her investments and helping her grow the family fortune. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, loyal to Evelyn but completely impartial when it came to the brothers. Simon scheduled a meeting with him and brought the documents from the safe. Prescott examined them carefully, his brow furrowing as he read through the addendum. "This is interesting," he said finally. "It's not legally binding, but it does paint a clear picture of your grandmother's intentions." "What should I do?" Simon asked. Prescott leaned back in his chair. "You need to make your brothers realize that fighting you won't end well for them. Show them you're not as easy to push around as they think." Simon wasn't sure how to do that, but Prescott had an idea. A few days later, Mark and Joe received an anonymous tip. Someone claimed that Simon was planning to challenge the will in court, using hidden documents that would paint Mark and Joe as unfit heirs. The tip was vague, but it was enough to send them into a panic. Mark stormed into Simon's room, holding a stack of legal papers. "What the hell is this about you challenging the will?" he demanded. Simon, who had been expecting this, stayed calm. "I haven't filed anything yet." Joe was right behind him, his face red with anger. "This is why we can't trust you. You're trying to screw us over, aren't you?" Simon folded his arms. "I'm just doing what Grandma wanted. If you two are so sure you're in the right, then you have nothing to worry about. Right?" It was a masterful move. Simon had planted the seed of doubt, making Mark and Joe question how strong their position really was, but Mark and Joe weren't the type to back down. They hired their own lawyer, someone with a reputation for digging up dirt. And sure enough, they found something, an old arrest record from Simon's college days. It wasn't anything serious, just a misdemeanor for protesting without a permit, but they twisted it into a narrative that painted Simon as irresponsible and unreliable. They even went so far as to leak it to a local paper, ensuring it would reach extended family members. Simon was devastated. "I was standing up for something I believed in," he told me. "And now they are using it to make me look like a criminal." But if Mark and Joe thought this would make Simon back down, they were dead wrong. The final straw came when Simon discovered that Mark and Joe had filed a petition to have him removed as an executor of the estate. Their argument: that Simon was mentally unfit to handle the responsibility. Simon was furious. "They are trying to paint me as unstable," he said, pacing back and forth in my living room. "They are making me out to be the bad guy so they can take everything." But instead of falling apart, Simon did something unexpected. He filed his own petition, this time challenging the validity of the entire will. It was a risky move, but it forced the court to re-examine the terms of the inheritance, and let me tell you, what came next was nothing short of explosive. The battle was far from over, and the stakes were getting higher by the day. Stay tuned for part 3, because the gloves are about to come off. If you thought things couldn't get worse after Simon challenged the will, buckle up, this is where the real fireworks started. By this point, the family wasn't just divided, it was a full-blown war. Mark and Joe were pulling every dirty trick in the book, and Simon was running out of ways to fight back. But the crazy part: the final blows came from directions no one saw coming. The courtroom was packed the day Simon's petition was heard. Everyone in the extended family showed up, eager to see how the battle would unfold. Mark and Joe arrived with their high-powered lawyer, a woman who looked like she ate contracts for breakfast. Simon, meanwhile, had hired a small but respected firm Prescott had recommended. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge called the session to order. Simon's lawyer started strong, presenting the documents from Evelyn's safe as evidence of her true intentions. This addendum, while not legally binding, provides clear insight into Mrs. Carter's wishes, the lawyer argued. It's evident she intended for Simon to receive a significant portion of the inheritance. Mark's lawyer wasn't having it. "Your Honor, this document is irrelevant. The only valid legal document is the will itself, which requires unanimous agreement among the heirs. Anything else is conjecture." The judge nodded, taking notes. It was a toss-up which way things would go. But then Mark and Joe's lawyer dropped a bombshell. "We have evidence," she said, standing up dramatically, "that Simon Carter has a history of reckless and erratic behavior. His actions in the past demonstrate that he is unfit to manage a significant inheritance." She handed a file to the judge. Inside was the arrest record from Simon's college days, blown wildly out of proportion. There were also a few exaggerated statements from distant family members claiming Simon had always been irresponsible and unreliable. Simon's lawyer objected, of course, but the damage was done. The court recessed without making a decision, leaving everyone in suspense. After the hearing, Simon was dejected. "They are dragging my name through the mud," he told me. "How am I supposed to fight back when they've already poisoned everyone against me?" That's when Prescott stepped in. "You don't fight their way," he said. "You fight smarter." Prescott had been quietly working behind the scenes, gathering his own evidence. He had records of questionable financial transactions Mark and Joe had made over the years, shady investments, tax loopholes that bordered on illegal, and even a few suspicious loans from Evelyn's accounts. "These aren't smoking guns," Prescott admitted. "But they are enough to make Mark and Joe sweat. Use this as leverage." Simon hesitated. He'd never been comfortable with blackmail, but at this point, he didn't have many options. At the next family meeting, Simon decided to play his hand. He walked in holding a thick folder, his expression unreadable. Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Here to surrender." Simon ignored him. "I want to make one thing clear," he said, placing the folder on the table. "If you two keep pushing me, I'm prepared to fight back. And when I do, it won't just be about the inheritance. It'll be about everything you've ever done." Joe's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" Simon slid the folder across the table. "Open it and find out." Mark hesitated, then opened the folder. His face went pale as he flipped through the pages. Joe leaned over to look, and his reaction was just as bad. "This is nothing," Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Simon replied. "But it's enough to start an investigation. And I'm pretty sure the IRS would love to take a closer look at your finances." The room was dead silent. For the first time, Simon had the upper hand. Later that night, Mark and Joe called Simon to a private meeting. "I wasn't there, but Simon told me everything afterward. They tried to play nice," he said, shaking his head. "Offered me $200,000 to walk away quietly." "Did you take it?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Of course not. I told them I wanted an equal share, $400,000, or I'd go public with everything." Mark exploded, accusing Simon of being just as greedy as they were. Joe tried to smooth things over, but it was clear they were panicking. In the end, the meeting ended with no resolution, but Simon wasn't done yet. Just when it seemed like the battle would drag on forever, something completely unexpected happened. The lawyer handling Evelyn's estate called an emergency meeting. "There's been a development," he said, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "While reviewing Mrs. Carter's accounts, we discovered a discrepancy in the estate's valuation. Specifically, a missing account." Everyone sat up straight. "Missing?" Mark asked. The lawyer nodded. "It appears Mrs. Carter had a private savings account she never disclosed. It contains an additional $300,000. The room erupted into chaos. Mark and Joe immediately started arguing about how the money should be divided, while Simon just sat there, stunned, but the real kicker came next. "Mrs. Carter left explicit instructions regarding this account," the lawyer continued. "It is to be given entirely to Simon." Mark and Joe lost it. They accused the lawyer of lying, threatened to sue, and even tried to claim the account was a forgery. But the evidence was clear. Evelyn had set aside that money specifically for Simon, knowing he'd need a safety net against his brother's schemes. For the first time, Simon felt like he'd won. The $300,000 wasn't as much as the original inheritance, but it was enough to give him some security. And more importantly, it sent a message to Mark and Joe. They couldn't break him, but the war wasn't over yet. Mark and Joe were furious, and they weren't going to let Simon walk away without a fight. Stay tuned for part 4, because the real showdown is just around the corner. If Simon thought the discovery of Grandma Evelyn's hidden account would settle things, he was dead wrong. Mark and Joe weren't the kind of people to admit defeat, especially not when $900,000 was still on the table. What happened next turned the family feud into an all-out war, and honestly, it's a miracle anyone survived it with their sanity intact. Mark and Joe strike back. Within days of Simon's win, Mark and Joe were back at it, this time armed with a new strategy. They filed a formal appeal, claiming the hidden account and its allocation to Simon were illegitimate. Their argument: Grandma Evelyn had been coerced by Simon in her final years, a claim so absurd it should have been laughed out of court, but Mark and Joe weren't stupid. They backed up their story with cherry-picked evidence, isolated incidents where Simon had spent more time with Evelyn in her final months, and a few manipulated statements from extended family members. The hearing was scheduled, and it was clear Mark and Joe weren't just trying to overturn the account, they were aiming to discredit Simon completely. Simon was panicking. "They are twisting everything," he told me one night. "I didn't do anything wrong, but the way they are spinning it. I don't know how to prove my innocence." That's when I remembered something. The attic had been Grandma Evelyn's treasure trove, filled with decades of diaries, letters, and records she'd kept meticulously. We'd barely scratched the surface when we cleared it out, and I had a gut feeling there might be something up there that could help Simon. So, late that night, we went back to the mansion. We combed through boxes for hours, and just when we were about to give up, Simon found it, an old leather-bound journal, tucked away in a drawer. It was Evelyn's diary from the last 2 years of her life. Simon opened it carefully, flipping through the pages until he found an entry that made his jaw drop. "Today, I finalized the account for Simon. I know Mark and Joe will be furious when they find out, but this isn't about fairness, it's about justice. Simon has always been the one who cared for me without expecting anything in return. The others will try to take everything, but I trust Simon to use this money wisely. It's my way of protecting him when I'm no longer here." Simon's hands were shaking as he read it aloud. It wasn't just a smoking gun, it was a flamethrower. The day of the hearing was a spectacle. Mark and Joe came in with their lawyer, looking smug and confident. Simon looked nervous but determined, clutching the diary like a lifeline. Mark's lawyer started strong, presenting their case with a mix of fake concern and calculated accusations. She painted Simon as a manipulative opportunist, preying on an elderly woman to secure more money for himself. Simon's lawyer let them finish before calmly presenting the diary. "This is Mrs. Carter's personal diary, kept during the final years of her life," the lawyer said. In it, she clearly states her reasoning for creating the separate account and leaving it to Simon. There is no coercion here, only a mother's love for her son. The courtroom went silent as the judge examined the diary. You could see Mark and Joe's lawyer scrambling, trying to come up with a rebuttal, but it was over. The diary was the final word. The judge ruled in Simon's favor, upholding the allocation of the hidden account and rejecting Mark and Joe's claims. You'd think that would have been the end of it, right? But no, because Mark wasn't done. A week after the ruling, Simon received an anonymous tip. It was a copy of an email chain between Mark and Joe, discussing plans to forge a new will entirely. They hadn't gotten far before the court case derailed them, but the intent was clear. Simon was furious. He confronted Mark and Joe at a family gathering, slamming the printed emails on the table in front of everyone. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Mark tried to deny it, but Joe cracked under pressure. It was Mark's idea, he blurted out. "I didn't even want to do it." The room exploded. Family members who had been on the fence about the whole ordeal finally turned against Mark and Joe. The fallout was catastrophic. Mark and Joe's reputations were destroyed, not just within the family but in the community as well. Their shady financial dealings came under scrutiny, and they were forced to settle several lawsuits related to their business practices. As for Simon, he finally got what he deserved, an equal share of the inheritance. The final division was $400,000 each, and Simon walked away with his head held high, but the scars ran deep. The family would never be the same, and the brothers' relationship was irreparably damaged. In the end, Simon learned the hard way that money changes everything. But he also learned the value of standing up for himself, even when the odds were stacked against him. As for Mark and Joe, well, let's just say karma has a funny way of catching up with people. Stay tuned for the final part, where we'll unpack the surprising ways this story came full circle. The aftermath of the inheritance battle left scars that ran deeper than the money itself. Simon may have won his fair share, but what he gained in wealth, he lost in family. Mark and Joe, humiliated and exposed, retreated into their own separate worlds, cutting ties with Simon and even each other. But the story didn't end there. What happened in the months and years after the court's decision was even more surprising than the drama that came before. With his $400,000, Simon decided to start fresh. He bought a small home in a quiet town, far away from the toxic environment that had consumed him for so long. He used some of the money to pursue a dream he'd put on hold for years. Opening an art gallery. It was a modest venture at first, showcasing local artists and hosting community events. But over time, the gallery grew, earning Simon a reputation as a kind, creative soul who cared more about passion than profit. "Grandma would have loved this," he told me one day as we walked through the gallery. "She always said the world needed more beauty." It was a peaceful life, until the past came knocking. The first unexpected twist came about a year after the inheritance was settled. Mark showed up at Simon's gallery one afternoon, unshaven and looking about 10 years older than he was. "I need to talk," he said, his voice low and strained. Simon hesitated but eventually agreed to sit with him. Over coffee in the gallery's back office, Mark spilled everything. After the court case, Mark's business ventures had taken a nosedive. The legal fees, combined with bad press and a string of failed investments, had left him nearly bankrupt. His once lavish lifestyle was gone, replaced by a mountain of debt. "I screwed up," Mark admitted, tears welling in his eyes. "I let greed ruin everything. I don't even know who I am anymore." Simon, to his credit, didn't gloat. He listened, offering quiet support but not letting Mark off the hook. "What do you want from me?" Simon finally asked. I don't know. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Joe's downfall came a little later, and it was even more dramatic. He'd always been the slick one, the charmer who could talk his way out of anything. But that charm had limits, and they were tested when he got involved in a shady real estate deal. The deal fell apart, and Joe found himself facing a lawsuit from investors who accused him of fraud. His assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed, and for the first time in his life, Joe had nowhere to turn except, of course, to Simon. When Joe called, Simon was hesitant to answer. But curiosity got the better of him, and they ended up meeting at a diner. Joe looked just as desperate as Mark had. "I need help," he said, cutting straight to the point. "I'm not asking for money, I know I don't deserve that. But I need a character reference. If I can convince the court I wasn't acting maliciously, I might have a chance." Simon stared at him for a long time before answering. "You tried to destroy me, Joe. Why should I stick my neck out for you now?" Joe had no answer. He just sat there, silent, as Simon stood up and left. Despite everything, Simon couldn't completely turn his back on his brothers. Over time, he began to soften, not because they deserved it, but because he knew that holding on to anger would only weigh him down. When Mark called again a few months later, Simon invited him to dinner. When Joe sent a handwritten apology letter, Simon replied with a short but kind note. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a step toward healing. The brothers never fully reconciled. There were too many wounds, too much history. But they found a way to coexist, sharing occasional phone calls and holiday cards. The final chapter of this saga came years later, when Simon was going through an old storage trunk from Evelyn's mansion. Among the photos and keepsakes, he found one last letter addressed to all three brothers. It read **** Mark, Joe, and Simon, if you're reading this, then my plans didn't go as smoothly as I'd hoped. I wanted my legacy to bring you closer together, not tear you apart. But life is messy, and people make mistakes. My wish for all of you is simple: be better. Be better than I was, better than your father was, better than the petty arguments and schemes that divide you. In the end, money doesn't matter, it's what you do with it that counts. I hope you find peace, even if it takes time. Remember, you're still brothers. And that's worth more than anything I could have left you. ***. Simon read the letter twice before folding it carefully and putting it back in the trunk. Did it bring us closer? He said aloud, shaking his head. Not exactly. But maybe it's not too late. In the end, Grandma Evelyn's inheritance didn't go the way she'd planned. The money caused more pain than joy, more conflict than resolution. But it also forced the brothers to confront who they were and who they wanted to be. Simon used his share to build a life he was proud of. Mark and Joe, though bruised and battered, learned lessons they might never have faced otherwise, and while the family would never be the same, there was hope. Because sometimes, even in the midst of chaos, people can change, and that, I suppose, was Evelyn's real legacy.